Welcome to the introductory video on ancient Egypt. And as I always like to do, in this video we're going to take a look at the major timelines in ancient Egypt, and then we'll break down each one of those in the coming videos. Now, ancient Egypt was a fascinating and absolutely incredible civilization, and it had a very vibrant culture that is worth every bit of our examination and study. Now, the two most iconic images are the pyramids on the left and King Tut on the right. And I think if you picked two images that represented ancient Egypt, these would be it. And of course, King Tut's tomb was only discovered in 1922. And before that, his name was essentially lost to history. But after the discovery of the tomb, a tomb which was pretty much left intact throughout the eons of time, this made King Tut the most famous pharaoh of all time, even more famous than Ramesses, even though during his own time, King Tut was somewhat of a minor pharaoh. Now, before ancient Egypt existed, there were hunter-gatherers like every area around the world. Humans were pretty much a hunter-gathering society, and eventually that evolved into an agricultural society. Now, Egypt during its time was very, very wealthy. It was a rich, fertile land with plenty of food and supplies, and life was pretty good. The Egyptians were relatively safe from outside threats until later times, and we'll get to those, but pretty much they had an independent existence. Now, ancient Egypt was a top-down society, and the pharaoh was at the very top. And as I said, Egypt had very, very long periods of stability, sometimes almost 500 years. Now, there were around 170 pharaohs of Egypt, right up until the time of Cleopatra, who was the last active pharaoh. And we'll be talking about her and almost every pharaoh in the next several videos. And of course, the pharaohs had this very, very busy afterlife, and that is represented by the massive tombs that we see all around ancient Egypt. And with tombs and pharaohs, their treasure was buried with them. And that's another thing that ancient Egypt is very, very well known for, especially King Tut's tomb, which we just talked about in the last slide. And of course, the ancient Egyptians are the great builders in history. We know that through the massive pyramids and temples that they built. And of course, one of the most famous pyramids is the pyramid in Giza. And if you can imagine this, that was the tallest man-made structure for almost 3,800 years. Rome, Greece, Persia, they did not surpass that height. Even though they had fabulous structures themselves, they never built a structure that was that tall. It wasn't until the actual last millennia that the Great Pyramid of Giza was surpassed in height. And during that time, it's believed almost 40,000 people were working on the Great Pyramid of Giza. And we'll talk about that when we get to the time period of the Old Kingdom. Now, the pharaohs themselves were considered god kings, and after their deaths, they became gods themselves and were worshipped in several temples that were built for them. And there were many great pharaohs throughout the ages that we will cover in this series. And about the gods were very, very important to the ancient Egyptians, and they had hundreds of deities. And rather than do a video on them, I'm going to introduce sporadically throughout the series a deity in each video. And in this video, we'll talk briefly about Anubis, who you can see there on the right. He was considered the protector of the dead. And as you can see, he is one of those animal-headed gods, part human, part animal. And the Egyptians had several gods like that because agriculture was very important to the Egyptians. And so we will see animals all over the place in ancient Egypt, in their gods, in the hieroglyphics, and we will see snakes, crocodiles, oxen, falcons, several different types of animals. Now, in terms of Anubis, he is a jackal-headed god who is associated with the afterlife, and he acted as a custodian of the dead on their journey to the afterlife. And he also was involved in the mummification process. Now, there are two major periods in the history of ancient Egypt. First is the pre-dynastic period, which lasted from around 5,500 BC to 3,100 BC. And then there is the dynastic period, and this is when the first pharaohs arrived, which lasted from 3,100 BC right up until 30 BC, and that, of course, corresponds with the death of Cleopatra. Now, some people extend it after that, but pretty much most people have ancient Egypt ending around 30 BC. And one of the things that impresses me is this was a long, long time ago. If you can imagine, the first pharaohs were around 51 centuries ago. And if you think about that for a minute, that's almost 2,500 years before Rome was even founded. And of course, that is a legendary founding of Rome. It's also the same amount of time before classical Greece and the Persians. So we're dealing with extreme periods of history here. A period that saw ancient Egypt's rise to greatness long before many of these other classical civilizations existed in antiquity. Now let's break down each major epoch in ancient Egyptian history. And that's something I like to do at the beginning of each one of my series. And we'll be going through each one of these periods in the coming videos. Now the first major period is the pre-dynastic period, which as I said before was the time before the pharaohs. And that lasted approximately from 5500 BC to 3100 BC. And that can essentially be divided into two kingdoms, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And so this is before the unification that took place that ultimately became ancient Egypt. And actually we will go over the pre-dynastic period in the very next video. And then we get to the dynastic period, which is the major part of ancient Egyptian history. And much of the framework was laid out by an ancient historian named Manetho. And he was a historian that existed in the 3rd century BC during the time that the Greeks had control of Egypt. And it's Manetho that laid out the basic structure of ancient Egypt. He's the one that really got things going. He divided up ancient Egypt into the various dynasties that ruled Egypt. And a dynasty, of course, was a ruling house. And so much of the framework that Manetho laid out is used even today. Now, there have been some revisions on some of the dates, but the overall structure that he provided has pretty much remained the same. Now, there were 30 dynasties that ruled over approximately 3,000 years over ancient Egypt. Now, some people add a 31st and 32nd dynasty, but I think the generally accepted idea is that there were 30 dynasties. And so let's take a look at each one of these really quickly before we break them down later on. The first period is the early dynastic period, and that encompassed the 1st and 2nd dynasties. And during this time, Memphis was made the capital, and that would remain the capital for a large part of ancient Egypt's history. Now, in terms of the 1st and 2nd dynasty, information is very, very sketchy. There's quite a bit of debate about who the first pharaohs were, and even some of the times and dates that are involved, because this is a very, very long time ago, as I said. Now, the picture has cleared up somewhat through archaeology, but many of the pharaohs and even names of those pharaohs remains in dispute. Now, after the early dynastic period, we get to the time period of the Old Kingdom, and that encompassed the 3rd and 6th dynasties. And this is really where things got going for the ancient Egyptians. The great pyramids were built, and several of the great pharaohs began to appear. After the time period of the Old Kingdom comes a time period which has been referred to as the First Intermediate Period, and that represents a decline in royal power. And so there was some instability during this time period, and that lasted for a little over 100 years. And then we get to the Middle Kingdom, which encompassed the 11th and 14th dynasties, and that represented a resurgence in ancient Egypt. After that comes the Second Intermediate Period, which represents another decline. So you get the idea here. Intermediate periods are the declines, and anything named kingdom represented a resurgence in ancient Egypt. So after the Second Intermediate Period comes the New Kingdom, and it was during this time that Ramesses came about. And of course, he is regarded as one of the great pharaohs by Egyptologists. After that comes another decline in the Third Intermediate Period, and then we get into the Late Period. Now, during the Late Period, the Persians conquered Egypt, and this was a major event in ancient Egypt's history, because this was really one of the very first times that they lost their independence. And so this represents a real decline in ancient Egyptian civilization. They are at risk from invasions from the Persians, of course, at first, and then the Greeks, and later on the Romans. And then, of course, we get to the last period, which takes us right up until the time of Cleopatra, who, of course, committed suicide in 30 BC. Now, some historians will extend ancient Egypt after that, but Cleopatra was regarded as the last active pharaoh. Now, before we get going here, we'll take a look at the sun god Ra. And of course, Egypt is another one of those sun-worshipping societies, very similar to the Persians, who also worshipped sun gods. And Ra can also be referred to as Re. So he's referred to in two different ways, Ra and Re. And of course, he is another one of these part animal, part human gods. And that is a sun disk on the top of his head. Now, Ra was actually a god before the formation of ancient Egypt in 3100 BC, and becomes increasingly important as time moves on, and eventually he becomes the most important god in ancient Egypt. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video when we will discuss the pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt.